2024 Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has expressed support for Pink Floyd singer Roger Waters, who had been facing accusations of anti-Semitism after he wore a Nazi-reminiscent armband as an anti-fascist gesture during an anti-fascist song during one of his concerts. But did RFK Jr. end up walking back his support after all? Now, first on Saturday, in a now-deleted tweet, RFK Jr. said, "Roger, you are the global hero Orwell had in mind when he said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. The high priests of the totalitarian orthodoxies are trying to silence you with censorship, gaslighting, and defamation. Please keep speaking truth to power."
Then, in another subsequently deleted tweet, RFK seemed to walk back the support, writing, "In my remarks about Roger Waters, I was referring to his dissent on COVID and the war in Ukraine. I have only recently learned about some of his other views, which I do not share." And then in another tweet, he added, "I support Israel's right to exist within secure borders, and I also support the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people." Now, according to The Independent, German police have opened an investigation into Waters following complaints after this controversial, that should not have been controversial, performance in Berlin this past month. Host of the Sabby Sabs podcast, Sabrina Salvati, joins us now to discuss. Welcome.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. So there are, I think, two actually separate things here to discuss. One is how RFK has responded to all this, which I think is interesting and we're going to get into. But I just want to make sure everybody understands what happened here with Roger Waters and the accusations of anti-Semitism. He was doing a performance that is a critique of fascism, of Nazism, in which, in the course of the performance, he dresses up in a Nazi costume. But this is the same. This is like in the springtime for Hitler kind of
satire.
Right. It's satire. It's anti-fascist. It is not because he's aligned with fascism. So the people who were saying that he should be discredited over this are totally missing the point, right?
Correct. Roger Waters has been doing this performance for years, so this wasn't a one-time event or a first-time event. But I think it's not even so much about this particular performance as it is about why are media figures and why are the government agencies and why is the police state targeting Roger Waters at this point in time? I think it has to do with his opposition to the war in Ukraine. He's been very vocal about that. He spoke to the UN about that, calling for peace. But as I've mentioned before, even those who are calling for peace are being called Putin puppets, so to speak. And also because his views about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So that makes Roger Waters, I think, a controversial figure. What I want people to understand, though, is that Roger Waters is a musician. He's an entertainer. He's not a politician. He's not a journalist. And it's really odd to me that they're coming after someone who's a musician. What happened to the form of freedom of expression, so to speak? This is giving me Dixie Chicks, war in Iraq vibes. And I remember when they were canceled, when they opposed the war in Iraq. So it's unfortunate to see, but I don't think this will be the last time that Roger Waters is attacked.
All right, so let's get into the more political, explicitly political part of this, where, of course, Democratic presidential candidate RFK Jr. weighed in with supportive comments at first for Roger Waters. I think a lot of members of the left community were really heartened to see him throwing his hat in the ring there and intercede on Roger Waters' behalf, because he really was getting a ton of flack, being investigated by the German government, et cetera. But then those tweets were subsequently deleted and new tweets were issued, which seemed to want to create some room between himself and Roger Waters. What do you make of that, Sabby?
Well, his original tweet that he had, I applauded RFK Jr. for that. I was like, this is great to have someone who's a presidential candidate supporting Roger Waters when he's being attacked. So then I was kind of surprised when RFK Jr. chose to delete that tweet. I really do believe that someone tapped Bobby Kennedy Jr. on the shoulder and said, you may want to delete that tweet. It may not be good for your campaign if you're supporting that guy because of some of his views. And then he retracted it and then issued another tweet, as you showed, basically creating that space between himself and Roger Waters and showing people that, listen, my views and his views about Israel and Palestine are very different. But this is a really big concern because RFK Jr. said, one of the things that he would do on day one is free Julian Assange. Julian Assange, we have to remember, is in prison because he published war crimes that the U.S. government had committed. So you have to stand up to censorship. And if RFK Jr. believes that someone like Julian Assange should be free, which I support, then that means he has to stand up to censorship even when it applies to himself. He has to push back against people who are trying to censor him. Otherwise, people who are supporters of yours, and they're divided right now, some agree with what he did, but most of them that I've heard from do not agree with what he did. They're looking at you with the side eye saying, well, how are you going to free someone like Julian Assange? And you say you're for free speech, but then all you did was receive a little bit of pressure and immediately you retracted it and issued a different statement. We have to push back against the censorship, and that includes him as well.
Well, Sabby, there was that censorship piece of it, but others are reading into this that RFK Jr. might also not have the strength to stand up on the issue of Israel-Palestine and the relationship there. People perceive his subsequent tweets to basically be saying that he is unwilling to advocate for the rights and interests of Palestinians, at least to the extent that someone like Roger Waters has done. And that kind of shall we say, equivocation or line towing on that particular issue is something that the other insurgent Democratic candidate, Marianne Williamson, has gotten a lot of flack from, especially from the left community. Do you think that there is a similar thing happening here where there is a broader pressure to not cross a certain line when it comes to that particular conflict, and that both RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson are being rightly criticized for being perceived as not being as far left on that issue as some members of the left community would like?
Well, Bree, you know, this is a red line for me when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Like, I support the Palestinian people. I support BDS. I support that effort. And what I think has been very clear is that anyone who opposes what the state of Israel is doing right now, and they are a candidate or they are a politician, obviously there are going to be PACs that are championed against them to prevent them from succeeding in this race or going further in this race. Or if they're already a current politician, there were PACs brought up against people like Rashida Tlaib to try to prevent them from getting a re-election. So the sign has been very clear that if you go against the state of Israel, you are not going to receive that support from the media or so from politicians in D.C. as well. So yes, it is a big issue, and I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. knows that, and I think that's why he was pushed in a way. You might want to retract that tweet, but no, you have to stand up for what is right here. And I think this is what people have to really, really grasp. You cannot cave under the first little bit of pressure that you receive. People are looking at you in a certain way as how can you say that we need to have a peaceful revolution and you won't even push back against the government agencies that you claim to champion against? So the thing is that this issue with Israel and Palestine is a hot button issue. And for me, for someone as a voter, that's a line for me. I do not give, any type of leeway with that. You have to support, announce that you support the Palestinian people's effort here. And if you show me that you were just going to go along with the state of Israel because you're afraid you're going to get pressured, that is not something that I'm looking towards.
And
someone as a candidate.
He subsequently deleted the tweet. I think we had it on screen. I didn't, I guess, maybe catch its exact wording. Isn't what he said that he thinks there should be an Israel that's safe and secure, and also that he said he supports
the reasonable claims of the Palestinian people.
Sure. I don't think that's that's probably within. He is trying to. Maybe that's his actual view on the issue. I don't know that he's.
That's what's so interesting.
It probably is within where the majority of the American people are.
I think that's right, Robbie. What's so interesting about this story to me is that up until very recently, the idea of a two-state solution was perceived by many people on the broad left, liberals, et cetera, as kind of the general left party line. Mm-hmm. At some point between 2016, and that was Bernie Sanders' position as well, at some point between 2016 and now, that has changed such that when Marianne Williamson started saying comments about that earlier in at the beginning, before she even announced, she got a lot of flack from the left community. And now I think my question to Sabby is, do you think, given that RFK Jr., who has been really embraced by those same factions of the left community, has said similar comments, that he will get the same amount of pushback? Or do you think that Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. are being treated differently on this issue? And if so, why?
He received some of that pushback last night, actually, during my show. There were comments in the chat where people said, that's it, I'm done with him. I'm not giving him a chance. But to your point, in reference to mainstream media, I don't think it has been completely fair But I think some people may not have been aware about his views in reference to Israel and Palestine until that recent tweet. And that's when that woke some people up, so to speak. I know that some people on the left on Twitter have come after him for that response and said, what are you doing here? This is just ridiculous. And I think people have to understand, like, we've talked to people in the Palestinian community, and they had to educate me on this issue last year as well. And they explained to me that this is not a viable option. They told me that a two-state solution is not a viable option because this is kind of the equivalent to separate but equal, right? So we had separate but equal in the United States, but obviously we found that both sides weren't equal. A similar thing, if you look at Israel and Palestine, obviously it's not going to be equal because the Palestinians are the minority and they're not going to have the same amount of resources as the Israelis. So I think, like, I had to be educated on that issue. Now, RFK Jr. did say on the Breaking Points interview that if you can explain these things to him, he was talking about the vaccine, but if you can explain this to him, he's willing to listen. And if he's wrong, he'll change his point of view. So I would challenge the next person who interviews RFK Jr. to bring this up to him and see if he can be moved on this issue. It's at least worth a try, I think.
It's interesting also in that Breaking Points interview, some people picked up on the fact that he said, quote, I know that Israel has not a wall, but it has fencing systems and they have the same issue we do with African immigration and they've been able to stop it, alluding to Israel's border policies as something that should be admirable for Americans to adopt. People push back against that as well. So it's not the first time something like this has come up, but I do agree, Sabby, that it's kind of newer in his campaign and the trajectory of him making these kind of statements and weighing in on this issue. So I'm interested to see how his position continues to develop. Thank you so much for unpacking this with us here today.
Thank you.